What would you do if the boy sleeping outside your door was clutching nothing more than a piece of stale bread, too hungry even in his sleep to let it go? Now imagine reaching down to lift him inside out of the cold, and finding, tucked in his sleeve, the one photograph you thought only existed in your own locked drawer. That's the impossible night one of Chicago's most feared men is about to live through, 20 minutes before he even opens his own front door. None of it seemed possible, because as far as anyone in that house knew, Vincent Moretti didn't have a soft place left in him for anyone to find. He stood over the boy for nearly a full minute without moving, without breathing the way a man breathes when he's simply looking at something he doesn't yet understand. The boy lay curled against the cold marble steps, knees pulled to his chest, and in his small right hand, gripped the way a starving child grips the only thing standing between him and an empty stomach, was a single piece of bread. Half-eaten. Fingers curled tight around it even in sleep, as though some part of him, even unconscious, was still afraid someone might take it from him. It was such a small, plain thing to break a man's composure. But it did. Somewhere behind him, the black Cadillac idled at the curb, engine ticking as it cooled, headlights still cutting twin cones of light across the frost gathering on the driveway. And in those twin cones of light, a 7-year-old boy lay sleeping on the steps of a house that belonged to him, and 300 people were afraid to look directly in the eye, holding nothing but a crust of bread like it was the last meal he expected to get. Explanations, Vincent was about to learn, were a great deal harder to come by than second chances. The Moretti estate sat behind iron gates on the north side of the city, the kind of house that made grown men lower their voices without being told to. Stone columns. Black shutters. A fountain that hadn't run since the day Vincent's wife died, because he'd never once given the order to turn it back on. At 51, Vincent Moretti was the kind of man whose name made grown business owners find urgent reasons to leave a room. He'd built the Moretti organization out of his father's failing produce business into something with fingers in half the ports on Lake Michigan, and he ran every room he walked into the same way he ran his family, with total, practiced, unbroken control. His only weakness, the only thing he still wore that had nothing to do with power, was a thin gold ring on a chain under his shirt, a ring that had belonged to his wife, Elena, who had been gone 11 years now, and a photograph he kept locked in a drawer in his study that no one, not his consigliere, not his own brother, was permitted to touch. That night, he'd come home late from a meeting that had gone longer and colder than expected, the kind of meeting where men measured their words the way other men measured bullets. His driver, Salvatore, pulled the Cadillac up the long gravel drive at just past 11, and it was Salvatore who saw the small shape on the front steps first and put a hand out across Vincent's chest before he could step out of the car. "Boss," Salvatore said quietly, the way a man speaks when he isn't sure yet if what he's looking at is a threat or something else entirely. "There's a kid on your porch." Vincent's hand had gone instinctively to the inside of his coat, old habits built over 30 years of a life where a stranger on your property after dark rarely meant anything good. But then the porch light caught the shape properly, and what he saw stopped his hand cold. A boy. No older than 7. Thin jacket with a torn sleeve, no gloves, sneakers with the laces double-knotted the careful way a parent ties them when they won't be there to retie them later. Curled up against the cold stone the way children curl up when they've learned, far too young, that making yourself small is sometimes the only way to stay safe. Vincent got out of the car alone. He told Salvatore to stay by the gate, a request nobody in 11 years had ever heard him make twice. He crouched down slowly on the top step, the way a man crouches beside something that might spook and run, and it was only then, in the porch light, that he saw the bread clutched in the boy's fist, and beneath the frayed cuff of his sleeve, the corner of something else. Paper. Folded. Soft at the edges the way paper only goes soft after being touched 1,000 times by someone afraid of losing it. Vincent's chest went tight before his mind had even caught up to why. He reached out, not for the bread, he wouldn't have dared take that from a hungry child even if his life depended on it, but toward the folded paper peeking from the boy's sleeve. Gently, carefully, the way a man defuses something he isn't certain won't go off in his hands, he eased it free. He didn't need to unfold it to know exactly what image was on the other side. He had one just like it, locked in the bottom drawer of his study desk, hidden under a stack of old ledgers nobody was foolish enough to go looking through. A photograph of a woman with dark hair and a laugh caught mid-breath, standing in front of a hospital window holding a newborn baby wrapped in a blue blanket. His wife. And a son Vincent Moretti had been told, 11 years ago, in a hospital corridor that still visited him in his sleep, had not survived the night he was born. The boy stirred slightly against the cold stone, murmuring something in his sleep that Vincent couldn't quite catch, his fingers tightening reflexively around the bread even as he slept, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Vincent Moretti, a man 300 people crossed the street to avoid, felt his hands begin to shake. 2 miles across the city, in a cramped third-floor apartment above a shuttered dry cleaner, a woman named Rosa Delgado sat at her kitchen table with her phone gripped so tightly in both hands that her knuckles had gone the same pale white as the boys asleep on Vincent's steps. She was 34, a home health aide who worked double shifts most weeks just to keep the lights on, and for the last 2 hours she had been calling a number that rang and rang into nothing. "Please pick up, Mateo," she whispered to a phone that couldn't hear her. "Please, baby, just pick up." She hadn't meant to fall asleep on the couch after her shift. She hadn't meant for her nephew, a boy she'd been raising since his own mother, her younger sister, had died 2 years earlier from a heart that had simply given out too young, to slip out the fire escape while she dreamed the dead-tired dreams of a woman working 60 hours a week. She'd left half a loaf of bread on the counter that evening, the only thing in the kitchen besides eggs and rice, and when she woke at 10:30 to an apartment gone silent in the particular way that only means one thing to a person raising a child alone, both the bread and the boy were gone, along with a small metal box he kept hidden under a loose floorboard beneath his bed. A box Rosa had promised her dying sister she would never, under any circumstances, open. She hadn't opened it. Not once in 2 years. But she knew, the way you know things about people you love without ever being told directly, that whatever was inside that box was the reason Mateo sometimes stood at the window for an hour at a time, staring out at nothing, asking questions Rosa never had good enough answers for. Questions like, "Aunt Rosa, did my mom ever tell you who my dad was?" Questions Rosa had always answered the same careful way. "Someday, baby. When you're older. It's complicated." Complicated was the word she'd used for 2 years to avoid a truth her sister had made her swear on her deathbed never to speak aloud unless it became absolutely necessary. And now, standing in an apartment gone cold and empty at nearly midnight, Rosa was beginning to understand that necessary might have arrived a great deal sooner than either of them had ever planned for. Back on the Moretti estate, Vincent lifted the boy carefully into his arms, bread and all, the way a man lifts something he's terrified of breaking, and carried him inside through the wide oak doors his own father had installed 40 years earlier. The boy didn't wake, not fully, only murmured again in that same half-formed sleep voice, and this time Vincent caught the word clearly. "Mama." He laid the boy down on the leather couch in his study, the same study where the locked drawer sat 6 feet away, and for a long moment Vincent simply stood there, staring down at a face he was already beginning to recognize in pieces. The set of the jaw. The particular way the boy's dark hair fell across his forehead, a detail that hit Vincent like a physical blow because it was exactly, precisely, the way Elena's hair used to fall the same way, on the mornings before she pinned it back before Mass. Even in sleep, the boy's small fist stayed curled protectively around the last piece of bread, as though some habits of survival never fully let go, even once the danger has passed. His hands were shaking again as he knelt beside the couch, the folded photograph still warm from the boy's sleeve now resting in his own palm. The question that rose up in his chest wasn't gentle. It came up hard and fast and furious, the same way questions come up in a man who has spent 30 years learning that answers are usually found by force. Where did you get this? Who gave this to you? Why do you have my son's face folded into your sleeve like it's the only thing keeping you alive? Because Vincent Moretti had buried a son 11 years ago. He had stood over a small white casket in a Chicago rain that hadn't let up for 3 days, had told himself every single night since that some griefs simply don't have answers, only weight you learn to carry. And now that same face, unmistakably, impossibly, was breathing softly on his study couch, 7 years old, a piece of bread still gripped in one hand like a small, stubborn refusal to ever go hungry again. Vincent didn't sleep that night. He sat in the leather chair across from the couch where the boy lay curled around his half-eaten piece of bread, and for 6 straight hours, he did the one thing he had trained himself never to do in front of anyone. He watched, and he waited, and he let himself hope. At 4:30 in the morning, with the sky outside still the deep bruised blue that comes before dawn, Vincent finally rose, crossed the study on quiet feet, and knelt in front of the bottom drawer of his desk. His hand hovered over the brass handle for longer than he would have liked to admit to himself. He hadn't opened this drawer in 3 years. Not since the last time grief had gotten the better of him on the anniversary of Elena's death, and he'd sat on this same floor with a bottle of scotch he never finished, staring at a photograph that was the only proof left that his son had ever existed at all. He pulled the drawer open. The ledgers were exactly where he'd left them, undisturbed, a thin layer of dust along their spines. He lifted them aside and found, beneath, the small wooden box where he kept the photograph. He opened it. It was empty. Vincent sat back on his heels, his breath going shallow in a way it hadn't gone since the night he'd taken a bullet in his shoulder 8 years earlier and hadn't allowed himself to feel the pain until the job was finished. The photograph in his hand, the one he'd taken from the boy's sleeve hours earlier, wasn't a copy. It wasn't similar. It was the exact photograph that belonged in this exact box, down to the small water stain in the corner where a single tear had fallen 11 years ago in a hospital hallway. Which meant someone had been inside this house. Inside this locked room. Inside a drawer only Vincent himself had ever touched. Or, a colder thought arrived, one that made the hair rise on the back of his neck, someone had taken it a very long time ago, long before Vincent had ever learned to lock the drawer at all. He turned, slowly, and looked back at the boy sleeping on his couch, and for the first time, he let the question he'd been holding at arm's length all night finally land with its full weight. What if my son never died at all? Rosa didn't wait for morning. By 1 a.m, she had already called every neighbor, every friend from Mateo's school, every corner store within 6 blocks that might have had a boy matching his description come through the door. Nothing. By 2, shaking too hard to keep dialing, she'd called the police, given a description through a voice that kept breaking apart mid-sentence. 7 years old, brown jacket with a torn sleeve, might be carrying a metal box. Please, please, he's never done anything like this before. The officer on the phone, kind but tired, told her what officers always tell frightened women at 2 a.m. That most kids turn up within a few hours. That she should stay by the phone. That someone would call if anything came in. Rosa didn't stay by the phone. She grabbed her coat, her sister's old rosary that she still kept looped over the bathroom mirror, and went out into the cold to walk the same 6 blocks Mateo had walked 100 times before, calling his name into a city that gave nothing back but the sound of her own voice echoing between buildings. It was near a bus stop 3 blocks from her apartment that she found the first piece of the puzzle she never expected. A boy, maybe 9, huddled under the awning of a closed bodega, eating from a bag of chips he'd clearly bought with change scraped together from somewhere. Rosa recognized him vaguely, a kid from Mateo's building, and she crouched down in front of him with a desperation that made the boy's eyes go wide. Have you seen Mateo? Dark hair, about this tall, He was asking about a rich guy, the boy blurted, before she'd even finished. Like an hour ago. Asked me if I knew where the big houses were. The ones up north with the gates. He had a picture he kept showing people. Some lady with a baby. Rosa's whole body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Which direction? She whispered. Which way did he go? The boy pointed north, toward the part of the city where the streets widened and the houses grew iron gates and the kind of quiet that money buys. Rosa was already running before he finished pointing. By 6 a.m, sunlight beginning to creep gray and thin through the tall windows of the study, the boy on Vincent's couch finally began to stir. His eyes opened slowly, confused at first by the unfamiliar ceiling, the unfamiliar softness of leather under his cheek, and then, all at once, wide with the particular fear of a child who has fallen asleep in one place and woken up somewhere else entirely. He sat up fast, one hand instinctively closing tighter around the last crumbling piece of bread he still hadn't finished, the other patting frantically at his sleeve where the photograph should have been. It's gone, he said, panic climbing fast into his small voice. Where's my picture? I need it back. It's right here. Vincent's voice came out lower and gentler than he had used with anyone in 11 years, and he held the photograph out slowly, the way you'd offer your hand to something wild and frightened. You're safe. Nobody's going to hurt you. What's your name? The boy stared at him for a long moment, calculating in the quiet, careful way children learn to calculate when the adults in their life have taught them that trust is something you ration carefully. Mateo, he said finally. Mateo Delgado. Vincent's jaw tightened at the surname. Not his own. Not Elena's family name either. A stranger's name, attached to a face that looked back at him from 11 years in the past every single time he closed his eyes. Mateo, Vincent repeated slowly, testing the shape of the name in his mouth like it might crack apart if he said it wrong. Where did you get this photograph? Mateo's small chin lifted, a flash of something stubborn and protective crossing his face, the same expression, Vincent realized with a jolt, that Elena used to wear whenever anyone questioned something she'd already made up her mind about. "It was in my mom's box," Matteo said. "The one I'm not supposed to open. But I opened it anyway because I wanted to know who my dad was, and everybody kept saying someday, someday, and I got tired of waiting for someday." "Your mother," Vincent said carefully, his heart beating so hard now he could feel it in his throat. "Is she?" "She died," Matteo said, the words coming out flat and practiced, the way children say things they've been forced to say so many times the grief has worn smooth at the edges, like a stone in a river. 2 years ago. I live with my Aunt Rosa now. But I found the box, and there was a picture with your wife in it, so I thought," he stopped, and for the first time since waking, his composure cracked, his voice dropping to something small and hopeful and terrified all at once. "I thought if I found the men in the picture, maybe he'd know who my dad was. Because nobody will tell me. Nobody will ever just tell me." Vincent sat very still. Because the photograph Matteo held wasn't a photograph of a stranger. It was a photograph of Elena. Of Vincent's own son, born and, he had been told, lost, the same night, 11 years ago, in a hospital room Vincent had not been allowed to enter until it was already over. And sitting 3 feet away from him now was a boy who called a dead woman named Delgado his mother, who had never once heard the name Moretti, and who was looking up at Vincent with Elena's exact eyes, waiting, the way children wait, for an adult to finally, for once, tell him the truth. The gate buzzer rang at 7:15, sharp and insistent, followed almost immediately by a woman's voice through the intercom, breathless, half shouting, half pleading. "Please, my name is Rosa Delgado, I'm looking for my nephew, someone said he came this way, please, I know this sounds insane, but please." Vincent looked at Matteo. Matteo looked back at him, bread finally forgotten in his lap, eyes wide with the dawning realization that whatever answer he'd been chasing all night was about to walk through that gate and change everything he thought he understood about his own life. Vincent rose slowly, crossed to the intercom, and pressed the button with a hand that had stopped shaking only because he had finally, after 11 years, found something he was more afraid of than fear itself. "Let her in," he said quietly to the men stationed at the gate. Then, turning back to the boy who might, impossibly, be his son, he added, so softly it was almost lost, "It's time somebody told the truth in this family. Might as well start this morning." Rosa came through the gate at a run, coat flapping open, hair still tangled from a night without sleep, and the moment she saw Matteo standing on the wide stone porch beside a man in a rumpled dress shirt, 3 days' worth of exhaustion behind his eyes, every ounce of fear in her chest turned instantly to fury. "Matteo Andres Delgado," she said, crossing the last 20 feet of gravel driveway so fast she nearly stumbled, "do you have any idea what I've been through tonight? I called the police. I walked every block between here and our apartment. I thought," her voice cracked clean in half, and whatever anger had carried her through the gate collapsed all at once into something rawer. She dropped to her knees on the cold stone and pulled him into her arms so hard he gasped. "I thought I lost you too." "I'm sorry, Aunt Rosa," Matteo mumbled into her shoulder, and for a moment he was just a boy again, not a mystery, not a photograph, just a frightened child clinging to the one person who had shown up for him every single day since his mother died. "I just wanted to know. I'm tired of not knowing." Rosa held him tighter, eyes squeezed shut, and it was only then, over the top of his head, that she finally looked up and saw the man standing in the doorway behind him. Her whole body went rigid. She knew that face. Not personally. Never personally. But she had seen it in newspapers, in the careful, fearful way people in her neighborhood lowered their voices whenever his name came up, in a photograph her sister had once shown her years ago with hands that trembled so badly the picture had nearly slipped from her fingers. "You," Rosa said, and the word came out barely above a whisper, thick with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite grief. "You're Vincent Moretti." "I am," Vincent said quietly. He hadn't moved from the doorway, hadn't taken a single step closer, some instinct in him understanding that a woman who had just found her missing nephew on a stranger's property needed distance before she needed anything else. "And I think you and I need to have a conversation your sister never got the chance to finish." Rosa's arms tightened around Matteo so fast and so hard that he made a small surprised sound against her shoulder. "What do you know about my sister?" she said, and this time it wasn't a question. It was closer to an accusation. "I know that 11 years ago," Vincent said, each word coming slow and careful, like a man walking across ice he wasn't certain would hold his weight, my wife gave birth to a son in a hospital on the west side. I know I was told that night, by a doctor I trusted, that my son had died within the hour. I know I buried an empty casket, because by the time I was allowed into that room, there was nothing left for me to see." He paused, and something in his composed, dangerous face finally broke open, just slightly, just enough. "And I know that the boy standing beside you is holding a photograph that was locked in my desk drawer 3 hours ago. A drawer nobody but me has ever had the key to." The color drained slowly out of Rosa's face. "That's not possible," she said, but there was no conviction left in it, only the sound of a woman hearing a truth she had spent 2 years, maybe longer, dreading. "Please," Vincent said. "Come inside. Whatever this is, we should not be discussing it standing on my driveway." Inside, in the same study where Matteo had slept only hours earlier, Rosa sat on the edge of the leather couch with her nephew pressed close against her side, refusing the coffee Vincent's housekeeper offered, refusing to let go of Matteo's hand even for a moment. Vincent sat across from them, the small wooden box from his drawer resting open and empty on the table between them like an accusation nobody had spoken aloud yet. "My sister's name was Camilla," Rosa said finally, staring down at her own hands. "She worked as a labor and delivery nurse. 11 years ago, at Northside Memorial." She looked up, and Vincent felt something in his chest go very still, because he already knew, the way you know the shape of a wound before the doctor tells you how deep it goes, exactly which hospital she meant. "She never told me the whole story," Rosa continued. "Not until she was dying. She said there'd been a mix-up that night. 2 boys born within an hour of each other on the same floor. One healthy. One who didn't make it. She said somebody above her, somebody with money and connections she was too afraid to name, made a decision in that hospital that night that she spent the rest of her life regretting being part of." Vincent's hands had curled slowly into fists on his knees. "She said the family who lost their son," Rosa went on, her voice dropping, "the dangerous family, her word, not mine, was never told the truth, because someone decided it was safer, cleaner, to let them grieve a child who had died than to explain what had actually happened to the one who hadn't. And the other mother, the one whose baby had died that night, she was young, alone, no family, no money, and someone paid her to disappear quietly and never speak of any of it again." The room had gone very quiet. Even Matteo, who didn't yet fully understand what he was hearing, had gone still, sensing the way children always sense that the ground beneath a conversation has shifted into something enormous. "My sister took the baby home herself," Rosa said, and now the tears she'd been holding back all night finally slipped free. "She said she couldn't live with what had been done, but she was too afraid to undo it either. So she quit nursing. She moved across the city. She raised him as her own, and she told herself every single day for 7 years that she was protecting him, when really," Rosa's voice broke entirely. "Really, she was just as guilty as everyone else who chose silence that night." Vincent sat frozen, the box on the table between them suddenly feeling like the heaviest object in the entire house. "Why?" he said, and his voice, for the first time all night, wasn't controlled at all. "Why would anyone do that? Who would have had the power to make that decision inside a hospital and walk away clean?" Rosa looked at him with an expression that was equal parts pity and dread. "My sister only gave me one name before she died," she said quietly. "She said if it ever came out, if I ever needed to know who to be afraid of, it was him. The head of the hospital board at the time." She hesitated, and Matteo looked up at his aunt with wide, frightened eyes, sensing that whatever name came next was going to change everything again. "Your brother, Mr. Moretti. Dominic Moretti." The name landed in the room like a dropped glass. For a long moment, Vincent didn't say anything at all. He simply sat there, hands still curled into fists on his knees, staring at the empty wooden box on the table as though it might rearrange itself into an explanation that made more sense than the one he'd just been given. Dominic. His younger brother. The man who had stood beside him at Elena's hospital bed 11 years ago, who had gripped Vincent's shoulder in that same corridor while a doctor delivered the worst news of his life, who had organized the funeral because Vincent had been too broken to make a single decision himself. Dominic, who now ran the shipping side of the family's legitimate businesses, who sat 2 seats down from Vincent at every holiday dinner, who had never once, in 11 years, so much as flinched when Elena's name came up. "That's not possible," Vincent said finally, and his voice had gone dangerously quiet, the particular quiet that people who knew him well had learned to fear far more than shouting. "Dominic was destroyed that night. I remember him. I remember him crying. I only know what my sister told me, Rosa said carefully, watching Vincent's face the way a person watches weather rolling in. She said Dominic came to her directly. Not to a lawyer, not through an assistant. Him, personally, the same night, before you'd even been allowed to see your wife. She said he told her there'd been complications, that the Moretti name couldn't survive certain kinds of scandal attached to it, and that it would be easier, cleaner, for everyone if the truth simply never left that hospital room. What scandal, Vincent said, and now there was an edge underneath the quiet, something sharpening. My wife had a difficult delivery. Our son was born early. What possible scandal? Rosa hesitated, and it was Matteo, small and still tucked against her side, who finally spoke, his voice startlingly clear in the heavy silence of the study. She said there was a paper, he said. In the box. I read it before you called, Aunt Rosa. I'm sorry, I know I wasn't supposed to, but I read it. Rosa's face went white. Matteo. It's okay, Vincent said gently, kneeling down slightly so he was closer to the boy's eye level, some instinct in him understanding that whatever came next needed to come from Matteo directly, not filtered through anyone else's fear. What did it say? Matteo swallowed hard, looking between the two adults like he was carrying something too heavy for a 7-year-old's hands. It said there was a test done. Before I was born, I think. A blood thing. It said I wasn't, he stopped, his small chin trembling. It said I wasn't really your wife's baby. It said there'd been a mix-up with the samples at the lab, months before, and somebody found out, and they were scared about what would happen if people found out a Moretti baby wasn't actually a Moretti baby by blood. The room went completely silent. Vincent felt something enormous and complicated move through his chest, something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief, but sat somewhere painfully between the two. You're saying, he said slowly, that the boy who died that night, the one I buried, was never biologically mine at all. That there had been some kind of error, months earlier, during the pregnancy itself. And rather than explain that error to me, my own brother chose to bury it. Along with an entire family's worth of grief. I don't know all of it, Rosa said quietly. I only know what my sister told me, and what little Matteo found in that paper. But I think, Mr. Moretti, your brother made a decision that night to protect the family name from a scandal that would have made you question your own marriage, your own son, everything you thought you understood about your own life. And instead, he let you bury a child who died of natural causes and simply never mentioned that the boy who survived, the one born to that other young mother that same night, wasn't yours either. 2 mix-ups. 2 lies stacked on top of each other. And somewhere underneath both of them was a little boy who deserved a family, and got shipped off into hiding instead, because it was easier than telling the truth to either household. Vincent stood up abruptly, crossing to the window, his back to the room, shoulders rigid in a way that made even Rosa go still with an old, instinctive fear. 11 years, he said, mostly to himself. 11 years, and every single family dinner, every holiday, every time I asked him to stand beside me at Elena's grave on her anniversary, he knew. He knew this whole time, and he let me carry a grief that wasn't even the real one. He turned back around, and his face had changed into something Rosa had only ever seen described in newspaper articles, something cold and absolutely still, the expression of a man deciding, in real time, exactly how much of himself he was willing to lose in pursuit of the truth. Where is this paper now? He asked. The one with the lab results. Matteo reached slowly into the pocket of his torn jacket and produced a small, folded square, worn as soft as the photograph had been, and held it out with both hands. I kept it with the picture, he said quietly. I didn't want to lose either one. Vincent took it from him with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible from a man whose face, only moments earlier, had looked capable of anything. He unfolded it slowly, scanned the faded typed lines, the hospital letterhead, a signature at the bottom that made his jaw tighten even further. Not Dominic's signature. A doctor's. But beneath it, in handwriting Vincent recognized instantly from 30 years of contracts and ledgers passed between them, a single line had been added afterward in blue ink. Handled. No further action required. DM. Vincent's phone rang at that exact moment, cutting through the silence like a blade. He looked at the screen. Dominic's name sat there, glowing, as though summoned by the very paper in Vincent's hand. He looked at Rosa. He looked at Matteo, small and uncertain on the couch, a boy who had spent his whole life being lied to by people who told themselves the lies were kindness. "Stay here," Vincent said quietly, sliding the paper into his jacket pocket beside the photograph. "Both of you. Whatever happens next, I need you to stay in this room." He answered the phone on the fourth ring, his voice dropping into something Rosa would later describe as the calmest, most frightening tone she had ever heard a human being use. "Dominic," he said. "We need to talk. In person. This morning. And you're going to want to bring every piece of paper you have from Northside Memorial, 11 years ago, because I think it's time you finally told me the truth you buried the same week you buried my son." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Vincent," Dominic's voice came through, careful, testing. "What's this about?" Vincent looked across the study at the boy sitting on his couch, Elena's exact eyes staring back at him from a stranger's face that somehow no longer felt like a stranger's at all. "It's about the boy on my front porch," Vincent said. "And about the fact that I finally know why he was drawn here in the first place. Blood remembers, Dominic. Even when we lie to it for 11 years. He hung up before his brother could answer. Dominic Moretti arrived at the estate 40 minutes later, alone, no bodyguards trailing him the way they usually did, which told Vincent more than any phone call could have. A man who came alone to a conversation like this one was a man who already understood there was no version of today that ended with him walking away clean. He came through the front doors carrying a slim leather folder pressed tight against his chest, and the moment he stepped into the study and saw Matteo sitting on the couch beside Rosa, his face went the color of old paper. Whatever explanation he'd rehearsed on the drive over, whatever careful, lawyerly version of the truth he'd planned to offer his brother, died somewhere in his throat the instant he saw the boy's face. Because Dominic recognized him too. Instantly. The same way Vincent had. "Vincent," he started, "I can explain." "Sit down," Vincent said, and there was nothing in his voice that left room for negotiation. Dominic sat. Rosa pulled Matteo a little closer against her side, though the boy, for his part, was watching the two brothers with the sharp, unblinking attention of a child who has learned that the truth, once it starts coming out, is often better watched carefully than looked away from. Vincent set the folded lab paper down on the table between them, the blue ink of Dominic's handwriting facing up. "Handled. No further action required." "Tell me what this means," Vincent said. "And I want to hear it from you, not from a piece of paper, not from a dead nurse's sister. From you. Right now." Dominic stared at the paper for a long moment before he finally spoke, and when he did, his voice had none of the polish it usually carried in boardrooms. "There was a mix-up," he said quietly. "Months before Elena gave birth. A lab error, during one of her prenatal tests. It flagged something, a paternity inconsistency, and the hospital, terrified of a lawsuit, buried it and never told either of you. I only found out the night she went into labor, when a doctor pulled me aside in a panic because he was afraid the story might come out and destroy the hospital's reputation right as your son was being born." He swallowed hard. "I made a decision that night, Vincent. The worst decision of my life. I decided you didn't need to carry that on top of losing your son. I decided it would break you in a way that losing a child alone wouldn't. So I buried it. I paid the doctor to keep quiet. I never imagined," his voice cracked. "I never imagined the other baby, the one who lived that night, would end up biologically connected to our family at all. That was a separate mix-up entirely. A blood sample switch during delivery itself. I didn't find out about that part until years later, and by then, the truth felt so much bigger than a decision I could undo quietly. So I did what I always do, Vincent. I handled it. I made sure the young mother was compensated, relocated, and I told myself that was mercy instead of what it actually was." "Which was what?" Vincent said, low and dangerous. "Cowardice," Dominic said, and for the first time in Vincent's memory, his younger brother looked genuinely, completely broken. "I was a coward, and I dressed it up as protecting the family, the same way I've dressed up every hard decision I've ever made for this family. I told myself you'd never have to know, that the boy would grow up safe and loved somewhere far away from all of this, and that would be enough. I never once asked myself what it would cost him to grow up not knowing where he came from. I never asked what it would cost that little boy to be raised by a stranger's family while his real father buried an empty casket 2 miles away." Rosa's grip on Matteo's shoulder had gone white-knuckled, and Matteo himself sat frozen, absorbing a truth far too large for a 7-year-old's shoulders to carry alone, though he was trying, visibly trying, to hold it anyway. "You let me grieve a son who never existed," Vincent said, and his voice, for the first time, wasn't controlled or cold. It cracked wide open. "You stood beside me at that funeral. You held my shoulder while I couldn't stand upright. And the entire time, you knew there was a real boy out there somewhere who needed a family, who needed me, and you decided silence was easier than telling me the truth." "I know," Dominic said. "I know, and there's no version of an apology that undoes 11 years, Vincent, I understand that. But I need you to understand something too." He looked, for the first time, directly at Matteo, something raw and guilty moving across his face. "I checked on him. Every year. Quietly, through people who never knew why I was asking. I made sure the money kept coming to Camila, and after she passed, I made sure it kept coming to Rosa, disguised as insurance payouts so nobody would ask questions. I told myself that was enough. That watching from a distance and making sure he never went without was some kind of penance." He shook his head slowly. "It wasn't enough. I see that now. It was never going to be enough." Rosa's head snapped up. "The insurance payments," she said slowly, something clicking into place behind her eyes. "The ones that started right after Camila passed. Those were you." Dominic nodded once, unable to meet her eyes. Matteo, who had been silent through nearly the entire conversation, finally spoke, his small voice cutting cleanly through the tension filling the room. "So which one of you is my dad?" he said. "For real. Not the paper version. The real version." The question landed heavier than anything either brother had said all morning. Vincent knelt down slowly in front of the boy, bringing himself level with Matteo's eyes, the same way he had the night before on the cold marble steps. "Biologically," Vincent said carefully, "the paper says neither of us, exactly. There was a mix-up, a long time before you were even born, that none of us understood until this morning. But I don't think that's actually the question you're asking me, is it?" Matteo shook his head slowly, eyes filling. "I'm asking who wants to be," he said, voice trembling. "Because I've spent 2 years wondering who I belong to. And I'm tired of the answer being nobody." Vincent felt something break open in his chest that had been sealed shut for 11 years, and for the first time since Elena's funeral, he let another person see him cry. "You belong to whoever chooses to show up for you," he said, reaching out slowly to rest his hand against the boy's shoulder, the same gesture Dominic had used on him in a hospital corridor over a decade ago, though this time it carried none of the lie underneath it. "And I intend to spend every single day starting this morning proving to you that I'm choosing you, Matteo. Blood or no blood. Paper or no paper." Across the room, Rosa was crying openly now, and even Dominic, hardened by 30 years in a business that didn't leave much room for softness, had to look away toward the window, his own eyes wet. It was, Vincent would later think, the first completely honest moment his family had shared in over a decade. The weeks that followed weren't simple, because truth this large is never simple, no matter how many times people wish it could be. There were lawyers, careful and quiet ones, the kind Vincent trusted precisely because they knew how to keep a family's business out of headlines without ever once suggesting a lie. There were paternity tests, formally administered this time, no hospital shortcuts, no buried lab errors, just plain honest science confirming what a piece of bread clutched tight in a sleeping boy's fist had already told Vincent the very first night. Matteo was not Vincent's biological son. The 11-year-old mix-up had been real, tangled and cruel in ways no single person could fully untangle. But biology, Vincent had come to understand somewhere between that first night on the marble steps and the weeks that followed, was never really the thing that had been missing from either of their lives. Rosa didn't lose Matteo. Nobody had ever asked her to, and the very idea of separating them had never once crossed Vincent's mind, not even in the rawest hour of that first confrontation. Instead, something slower and steadier took shape. Matteo kept his room at Rosa's apartment, kept his school, kept the aunt who had raised him with love even when love was the only thing she had enough of to give. But he also, every Saturday, took the drive north through the iron gates to a house with a fountain that, 3 weeks after that first night, finally ran again for the first time in 11 years, because Vincent had given the order himself, standing beside a boy who wasn't his son by blood but had somehow, in the space of a single terrifying night, become something even harder to name. Dominic didn't disappear from the family either, though something between the brothers had shifted in a way that would take years, not weeks, to fully mend. He came to the estate less often now, and when he did, he came quieter, gentler, a man visibly working to become someone worth trusting again rather than someone who simply expected trust to be handed to him because of blood and history. He started, without being asked, a scholarship fund at Northside Memorial for nurses like Camila, women who found themselves carrying impossible decisions handed down by people with more power than conscience. It wasn't absolution. Vincent made sure his brother understood that clearly, more than once. But it was, at least, a beginning. Rosa never had to work a third shift again. Vincent didn't offer charity, and she wouldn't have accepted it if he had. Instead, he offered her a position managing operations for the very scholarship fund Dominic had started, work that let her use the years of exhausted, thankless caregiving she'd already given the world and finally get paid enough for it to breathe. On a Saturday afternoon in early spring, 6 months after that first cold night on the marble steps, Vincent stood in the garden behind the estate watching Mateo chase a soccer ball across grass that had gone green and soft with the season, laughing in a way Vincent hadn't heard a child laugh in that house in over a decade. Rosa sat nearby on a stone bench, sunlight catching in her dark hair, finally, for the first time in 2 years, looking like a woman who slept through the night without fear. Vincent sat down beside her. "He still sleeps with that piece of bread wrapper in his pocket," Vincent said quietly, watching the boy run. "The one from that night. Won't tell me why." Rosa smiled, small and a little sad. "He told me once. Said it was the last thing he had that was only his, before everything else became complicated. Said he keeps it so he never forgets what it felt like to have almost nothing, and choose to share it anyway." Vincent looked down at his own hands, weathered by 30 years of a life spent gripping onto power, and thought about a hungry 7-year-old boy who had walked across half a city in the dark clutching a piece of bread he could have eaten and a photograph he'd refused to let go of, not for himself, but because some part of him, even starving, even afraid, understood that some truths were worth more than comfort. "Thank you," Vincent said finally, "for raising him the way you did. Whatever this family did to bring him into the world, you're the reason he turned out to be someone worth finding." This story reminds us that the families we're given and the families we choose don't always share the same blood, and that the truth, however long it's buried, has a way of finding its way home, usually carried in the smallest, most unlikely hands. Most of us are carrying some version of Vincent's locked drawer. A truth we've decided is safer left buried, a conversation we keep postponing because we've convinced ourselves the people we love are better off not knowing. It rarely works out that way. Silence doesn't protect the people we love. It only delays the moment they find out how much we were willing to hide from them. If there's a truth you've been sitting on, a phone call you've been avoiding, a conversation you've told yourself will be easier next month, next year, someday, this is the week to stop waiting for someday. Not with a dramatic confession. With something small. Sit down tonight, write down the truth you've been avoiding in plain, simple words, the way you'd explain it to a child who just wants an honest answer. Then find one person brave enough to hear it, and say it out loud. Somewhere tonight, someone you love is still waiting for you to stop protecting them with silence, and simply hand them the truth instead, even if it comes wrapped in nothing more than a piece of bread and a photograph too soft to unfold.